Well, thanks for joining me. My name is Matt Duhamel, Solitary Nation, for this Tuesday. A little different interview this week. Usually we talk to someone that has been personally affected by incarceration or is involved in some type of reform. But this week we are talking to Dr. Kipling Williams, a professor at Purdue University, who is the leading authority of social ostracism, stigma, and all those really negative impacts that we see in the community. So a little different, but we're going to get into some psychology and some reasons for this, and perhaps helping people that have been affected by incarceration and stigma. Thanks for joining me, Dr. Kipling Williams. I appreciate your time. How are you today?
I'm doing very well. Thank you, Matt. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. We're going to get into some interesting stuff. First of all, tell me a little bit about what you do at Purdue and your background.
Okay, well, I'm a professor of psychological sciences here. I teach undergraduates and graduate students, and I have PhD students. And most of my time is spent conducting research on the topic of ostracism, being ignored and excluded, and how that affects people.
Do you know the history of social ostracism? I know this isn't a new thing. It's been around for probably since the beginning of mankind. Would that be accurate?
Probably before that. So ethologists and anthropologists have who study animal behavior for social animals. Every social animal that's been studied their groups exhibit ostracism, and it usually leads to death of the ostracized member. So it's not just with humans, but it's also with all social animals. The word itself is relatively new. It was a word that came about in Athens, Greece, when they would meet together in a stadium and vote as to whether to exile usually a former leader for a period of 1 to 10 years. And they would write their votes down on a piece of broken clay, and those were called ostraca. So the word ostracism comes from that.
So it's would you say it's a normal thing? It's, how we create groups and communities?
Yeah, I mean, anthropologists regard ostracism as one of the cornerstones of civilization, and it's the threat of ostracism that keeps people sort of behaving civil and in a way that's similar to the other people of the group. And so when animals ostracize an individual in their group, it's because that individual is somehow a burden and poses a threat to the survival of that group. By ostracizing them, their group becomes slightly smaller but stronger. With humans, you can also, just the threat of ostracism or the beginning of ostracism can cause a correction of behavior so that the person starts to behave more similarly to the in-group, and hence they can avoid being ostracized. But just because it's a natural thing, I want to point this out early, doesn't mean that it's always good or it's always functional or it's always used appropriately. So where the behavior itself is probably evolutionarily ingrained in us, we overuse it, and we use it inappropriately, and we use it instead of more functional, healthy methods of interaction.
And some people call this a social death.
Yes, tribes from around the world often use ostracism as their most severe form of punishment, and the term that they use is often translated into social death. This is not just a metaphor for animals and for members of tribes who are ostracized. They often die within a couple of days to a week. They lack the resources of the group, they lack the protection of the group, they lack food from the group, and they become easy prey for predators. So it's very much linked into survival in all social animals.
You mentioned survival. Sounds like kind of survival of the fittest, and Abraham Maslow's theory of needs, what we need to survive or feel accepted.
Well, sure. At the very bottom, we need food and oxygen and things that allow us to survive. And if we have those, then we move up the triangle to more social needs, and being acknowledged for existing is in there. Having a sense of belonging is even further up, And so, yeah, these are all needs that various psychologists have talked about.
I want to read this quote, and then maybe you can just clarify this. This was, and I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. It's Gita Kapoor, a criminal defense and civil rights lawyer, and she has seen firsthand the impact of the label felon. She says a felony conviction operates as a lifelong sentence of legal, political, and social exclusion from benefits such as public and private housing, student loans, voting, employment, etc. Once someone is convicted of a felony, they are labeled for the rest of their life by their worst mistake and then banished to live outside mainstream society. We as a society refuse to forgive them. Forgive, that's kind of like the important word there. Is this about forgiveness too? Does that play a part in how people are ostracized?
It may. We have not really explored the link between forgiveness and ostracism uh, uh, very much at this point. We're talking now about why people ostracize rather than how people feel when they're ostracized. And people ostracize people that they think are not going to contribute to their group, or that are potentially, they see as they're afraid of them, or that perhaps because they can't forgive some previous transgression.
How do communities define, we and they?
Well, I think there are norms that develop within communities. I don't think there's any rules. It's not written down anywhere. But people within a community define we as people who represent what they think are the prototypes of their community. People who are employed, people who have perhaps families and who are involved in community activities would certainly be in-group members, and people who come from even just sometimes if you come from another place and you try to live in a community, some communities are not very welcoming of outsiders, of people from a different region of the country or something like that. But certainly if you have a record and that's known, that's going to be another stigma that they're going to use to identify you as an outgroup member and make it more difficult to become part of that group.
If you can answer this question, I'm not sure. What can ex-felons do to minimize, I guess, the threat of stigma? Something that they can do personally to reduce stigma and ostracism when they're re-entering society or they're just trying to get back on their feet?
Well, and that's a good question, because one of the best ways to cope with ostracism, seek out and be a part of groups, and that therein lies a danger, because it depends on which group you end up becoming a part of. You can become a part of a group that will help you get employment and be part of families and community, or you can be parts of groups that are still on the margins and are engaged in activities that are going to make things worse for you. So it's important to, I guess, seek out the groups that are going to be most beneficial to you, because when you're ostracized, you're vulnerable to any group who wants you. Any group that expresses an interest in you, you like that because, wow, somebody's paying attention to me, somebody likes me, and so you're more likely to just join any group, even a group that you might be better off not joining. And so you have to really keep your head about you in deciding what group is going to be most beneficial to me and my livelihood and my future, and then go about trying to become part of that group by being part of activities that the group values, starting at the bottom, not assuming, not being entitled, not thinking you're entitled to start somewhere up higher, but just starting, I would say, volunteering and showing that you are willing to do what it takes to be part of that group.
There are millions of children in the United States with an incarcerated parent, and they face a lot of, teasing, bullying, stigma. The question or the answer you just gave about minimizing stigma, is that the same type of thing for children as well when they're stigmatized?
Absolutely. And, it's heartbreaking what they have to go through. And again, when a child is ostracized, they seek acknowledgement, and they seek uh, people who want them and who value them. And if those kids who show interest in a child are gangs or groups that are involved themselves in delinquency, then that's going to just add to the kids' problems. So kids also have to be thinking about what groups and what that they want to belong to. But it's and sometimes when you're ostracized, you sort of give up on being liked, and instead you want to be noticed and you want to have an impact. And often the easiest way to be noticed and have an impact is to be antisocial, and so that can lead to negative consequences as well.
Pulling back then, hiding, I would think it would be more like getting out there and trying to make yourself noticed.
Well, right. And so, see, all of these things have two sides to them. You can become noticed for being good and helpful and kind and compassionate, or you can be noticed for, becoming violent. And so it depends on which way you go as to, but both of those things get you noticed. And sometimes it's easier to get noticed quickly for being violent than it takes a bit longer to be noticed for being good, unfortunately.
The classic Dr. Seuss story, The Sneetches. In this tale, Sneetches with stars on their bellies have more status than those without stars. Yet, even when the plain-bellied Sneetches get stars on their bellies, they are still denied entrance to the elite community of star-bellied Sneetches. Obviously, this is a children's book, but it seems to be related to being accepted big time here and feeling a part of the community. That seems like a pretty good example of what people face.
Dr. Seuss was really quite insightful in many of his books, which could be read at the level of for children, but also at the level of adults. And certainly that's true. Some people are born into a community and they're given higher status than those who sort of earn their way in from being outsiders, and they're never quite full members, and they're reminded of that frequently.
What happens emotionally and maybe sometimes physically when someone is ostracized? Because I know there are some negative effects from that.
Yes. So when we first detect that people are ignoring and excluding us, it causes pain. And we know that because when we study people who are in fMRI magnet laying down and having their brains imaged, and we ostracize them using this online virtual ostracism game called Cyberball, the pain center of their brain is activated. The dorsal anterior cingulate cortex detects pain and detects other things like surprise and violation of expectations. And other forms of ostracism have been studied, and they also activate regions of the brain that have more to do with the sensory responses to pain. So this is not just a metaphor. They actually detect and feel pain. They also have four fundamental needs threatened right off the bat. We have a need for belonging, to feel like we have a connection with other people. We have a need to maintain a reasonably high self-esteem. We have a need to feel that we have some control over our social environment, and we have a need to be acknowledged and to feel that our existence is meaningful. And all four of these needs have been shown to be threatened by very minimal and even subtle forms of ostracism in the lab. We can only surmise that in the real world, where it's much more persistent and the ways in which people are ostracized are so much stronger, that the threat would be that much more.
This may be, maybe kind of a tough one to answer, but in your professional opinion, is social ostracism for people that have been incarcerated adding to maybe the recidivism rate? How we're not maybe accepting of them, that they're have no choice but to, like you said, gain attention by doing negative things and perhaps doing more crime?
I think that it's absolutely related. When you feel ostracized, when you return to the community, you want to if you can't belong and you can't be liked, then you're going to want to have an impact. You're going to want to be provocative and be noticed. Also, perhaps the people who do want you, who do want to form friendships with you, are people who are involved in crime, in which case that's going to increase your likelihood of joining those groups because they want you, they value you, and also increase your likelihood for recidivism because your chances of getting caught for doing something bad are obviously higher. So I think that people who come out and face ostracism have sort of a clear path to recidivism.
In the 1980s, you first experienced social ostracism, if this brings back memory, when you were at a park with your dog.
Yes, I was actually interested already in the phenomenon of ostracism because I saw a documentary back in 1978 of a cadet at West Point who was silenced for 2.5 years, not looked at, not talked to, not responded to. They didn't eat with him at West Point because he apparently violated an honor code by not putting his pencil down at the precise time during an exam. And they did this to drum him out, but he stuck with it for 2.5 years. And that got me started in being interested. But several years later, I still hadn't started doing research on it, and I didn't really have a good idea how to do it. And then I was at this park with my dog, and I was looking at the lake, and a frisbee rolled up and went on my blanket, and I turned around and saw two guys waiting for it, so I stood up and threw the frisbee back to them. I was going to sit back down, but to my surprise, they threw it back to me. So I sort of joined them, and we started throwing it, the three of us, for a couple minutes. And then all of a sudden, and I still don't know the reason for this, they stopped throwing it to me. And they only threw it to each other. They only looked at each other, and I was left hanging there and feeling surprisingly bad, given the fact that I didn't know who these guys were, and I didn't really anticipate any future interaction with them. And when I sat back down with my dog, I kind of thought right then, wow, that is so powerful, and it is so easy to do. It's sort of context-free. I could do that in the lab. So I basically created two paradigms, two methods of studying ostracism from that event. One is called the ball tossing paradigm, where people are in a lab and one of them just starts tossing a ball around because they're waiting for the experimenter to come back. It's not part of the experiment. It's perceived to be just this emergent activity. And then the two people in the room who are really working for the experimenter either continue to include the real participant, or after a couple throws to the real participant, they stop throwing it to them altogether. And we only do this for a couple minutes, and it has remarkably strong effects. We then went to kind of, I guess, pull back a little bit and make it less powerful by creating what's called cyberball, which is when you are sitting by yourself in front of a computer and you're led to believe that you're tossing a virtual ball among two other people for the purposes of just trying to engage your abilities to mentally visualize an event. And again, the participant either gets the ball an equal number of times, or after they get the ball once or twice, they never get it again. And we do this for 2 minutes. And this is what over 200 studies have now used to determine what the impact of ostracism is on our brain, emotions, makes us angry, makes us sad, makes us ashamed, makes us feel uncertain about who we are. And the need threat that I mentioned earlier on belonging and self-esteem and control and meaningful existence, and then on subsequent behaviors that people might engage in to fortify the threatened needs.
You quoted saying being excluded or ostracized is an invisible form of bullying that doesn't leave bruises necessarily, but therefore we often underestimate the impact. Are people underestimating the impact of how being labeled like as a second-class citizen?
I mean, they underestimate the impact of ostracism because it's not like being made fun of. You're not openly derogated. You're not called names, and you're not hit or punched or in any way physically attacked. It's the absence of all those behaviors. So you're not looked at. You're not talked to. People don't eat with you at the table. And though that absence of behavior, we underestimate the impact of absence of behavior compared to behaviors, first of all. And so we know that people who are surveyed think that workplace bullying would be worse than workplace ostracism, even though the research on it suggests that both are quite negatively impactful at the time that they occur. But 5 years later, it's the ostracism experiences that lead to poor work performance, burnout, absenteeism, and things like that more than the bullying. The same thing has been found with children. If they're bullied or ostracized when they're under 10, both of those experiences are very bad for them. But 5 years later, what predicts their delinquency, their poor grades, getting involved in the use of drugs and things like that was the ostracism experiences more than the bullying experiences.
When people are, have a felony or whatever their crime was, they tend to, not everybody, but they tend to hide it from other people. And so it's that shame factor. How does that hurt somebody?
It's very depleting. When you're always hiding something, when you always have to monitor what you're saying and what you're doing and what people know about you, then a lot of your cognitive and emotional resources are spent worrying about that and not dealing with other things that could benefit you. So it could impair your work performance, it could impair your interpersonal relations with other people or with potential relationship partners, because a lot of your brain work is being devoted to monitoring what it is that you don't want people to know.
Someone with incarcerated or affected by prison, they are probably expecting some rejection. That rejection, from at least the community's point of view, may never end. But what can that person do emotionally to move past it?
Well, the research that's been done so far suggests that you don't have to be included by 10 people if you're ostracized by 10 people. If you're included by one person, that can offset and greatly nullify the impact of the emotional impact and the threatened needs to being ostracized by a larger number of people. So I think that, yes, there is an expectation of rejection, and just the expectation kind of helps prepare the person. But actively finding some support, and again, I repeat what I said earlier, it depends on who's supporting you as to whether this is going to be a good idea or a bad idea.
Sure.
Getting support of loved ones, of family, of people that are not involved in the criminal activity would go a great distance in helping you cope with rejection from other people.
Thank you again, Dr. Kipling Williams, professor at the Purdue University.
Thank you, Matt. It was a pleasure.